Hi, I'm Dr. Tanya Russell from James Cook University. And today we're going to be talking about insecticide resistance management, which is a really important component of the strategic plan. So what is insecticide resistance? It is the capacity of mosquitoes to survive exposure to insecticide treatments. This is important because many mosquito control programs rely on insecticides or materials treated with insecticides to kill mosquitoes. And to be effective, the mosquito population must be susceptible to these insecticides. So there's two different types of insecticide resistance that are recognised. On the left, you can see physiological resistance, which results from changes to the mosquito physiology that enable the mosquito to survive exposure to the insecticides. So this could be changes to the target sites that the insecticides bind to, or a stronger metabolism or detoxification, or even a thicker cuticle of the mosquito that minimizes absorption. It's the most commonest form of insecticide resistance. Another form is called behavioral resistance, and this refers to changes in the mosquito's behavior that help them to avoid exposure to the insecticide. So an example may be when insecticides are applied inside houses and the mosquitoes start to take blood meals outside and when people are outdoors to avoid exposure to the insecticides. We're going to focus on physiological resistance today. Physiological resistance develops in response to insecticide use, which selects for mutations, genetic mutations that occur naturally at low rates in the mosquito population. So as we can see, insecticides will kill the susceptible individuals and the resistant ones will survive. And repeated exposure to the same insecticide over a generation selects for mosquitoes that survive exposure to their chemicals that we use and increases the proportion of mosquitoes that are resistant. So insecticide resistance is important because it can reduce the impact of vector control tools. It may increase mosquito survival and abundance, resulting in a higher biting rate and ultimately increased disease transmission. So this map shows the status of insecticide resistance in Aedes aegypti mosquitoes to different classes of insecticide in the Pacific region. And although more extensive studies are needed, the available data suggests that many populations of Aedes aegypti are resistant to pyrethroids, and some resistance to carbonates and organophosphates has been documented. So what's really important is to conduct vector surveillance and insecticide resistance bioassays in each country and area, because it's always different. Some populations have resistance while others don't. So it's important to know the situation in your area where you're working. There's a range of different insecticides, and these are grouped together in classes based on their mode of action, the way that they kill the mosquitoes. It's really important to understand this because insecticide resistance usually develops at the level of the mode of action or insecticide class. So when insecticide resistance develops, it's important to switch to a different class of insecticide. So from a pyrethroid, and you may need to then switch to a carbonate or a neonicotinoid. So in the example on the screen, you can see 3 different pyrethroids that are listed. And if the mosquitoes are resistant to pyrethroids, they would be resistant to all of those different types of insecticides. There are also cases of cross-resistance that can develop between the different classes of insecticide. We're not going to quite go into that today. So physiological resistance is monitored using bioassays, so the WHO tube test or the CDC bottle bioassay. The mosquitoes that are exposed to the insecticide inside the bioassay are observed and counted, and it is determined whether the mosquito population is resistant or susceptible to the mosquito. And what I really want to highlight here is that conducting insecticide resistance bioassays is not insecticide resistance management. It's a very important component of the process. It's the part where information is gathered, and that information then is used to make decisions for the insecticide resistance management program. So what is insecticide resistance management? It's the decisions and the strategies that are used to prevent or delay the development of insecticide resistance. The purpose of insecticide resistance management is exactly that, to slow down this process. And historically, the most common way that insecticides have been deployed is through sequential use. So in essence, where one insecticide class is used continuously until the resistance has developed and rendered it ineffective, and then a switch is made to a different mode of action. Okay, so there's a few key principles that I would like to go over for developing an insecticide resistance plan. So firstly, insecticides should be deployed with care and deliberation to reduce unnecessary pressure. So vector control programs should avoid using a single class of insecticide everywhere and over consecutive years. Whenever possible, vector control programs should diversify from pyrethroids to preserve their effectiveness. Insecticide resistant management principles and methods should be incorporated into all vector control programs as a core component, not as an option. And the agricultural sector should be consulted as well. It's really great if the agricultural sector can consider minimizing the use of pyrethroids, as this is one of the most important insecticides for public health, as it can be used very safely in close contact with humans and inside houses. Routine monitoring of insecticide resistance is essential to inform the selection and deployment of insecticides, and the short-term additional costs of IRM should be balanced against the long-term potential public health impact and potential costs of insecticide resistance. So there are a number of different strategies that could be used for IRM. And most rely on using multiple classes of insecticides with different modes of action. So the rationale is that the mosquitoes could develop resistance to one of those modes of actions, but then they would be very quickly exposed to the other mode of action and potentially killed. So there's a couple of key points, and firstly, to be fully effective, the local mosquito population must be fully susceptible to all the insecticide classes used in the management strategy. It's also important to consider the residual life of the insecticides that are co-deployed, and these should have similar longevity in the field. And also IRM strategies should be implemented before resistance appears. So the first strategy that we're going to talk about is rotations, which involves switching between insecticides with different modes of actions. This could be a planned or triggered rotation scheme. In a planned rotation scheme, the program manager would decide at the beginning of the program to rotate insecticides with different modes of actions at set intervals. So this could be across sequential years that a different mode of action is used. And in a triggered scheme, there is a decision that is made when a trigger is met. An example could be the development of insecticide resistance. Mixtures involve using 2 or more insecticides with different modes of action at the same time. So with a mixture, the insecticides are put together into the one product that is deployed. This strategy is used quite frequently for drug treatments. So an example that we can take from the malaria field is for ACTs, the artemisinin combination therapies, where 2 different drugs are co-formulated into one tablet with the strategy to reduce the development of drug resistance. So an example for vector control could be indoor residual spraying with a mixture of a pyrethroid and a neonicotinoid insecticide. So ideally, all insecticides in the mixture should have a similar residual life and remain bioavailable for the same amount of time. And in practice, this is quite difficult to achieve, and particularly for a vector control where there's a limited range of insecticides that are available. For mosaics, this is when insecticides with different modes of action are deployed to adjacent geographical spaces. So this creates the potential for the insect within a single generation to come into contact with both insecticides by moving from one area to the other. Then different spatial scales could be used. For example, neighbouring villages could be treated with different insecticide classes, and also they could be very fine scale mosaics where neighbouring houses are treated with different insecticide classes. And either way, very careful record keeping is required to know which insecticides were previously used in which area. A combination is slightly different to a mixture in that the different modes of actions are deployed in different products in the same area. So an example could be pyrethroid-only bed nets co-deployed with a non-pyrethroid indoor residual spray. Another example could be a pyrethroid-based IRS co-deployed with a juvenile growth hormone-based larvicidin program. And the last strategy I'm going to talk about is synergists, which is a relatively new category. So in some cases of insecticide resistance, it develops where the mosquitoes overproduce a type of enzyme that is able to destroy the insecticide, so their metabolism becomes really good at flushing the insecticide out. And how a synergist works is by inhibiting this particular enzyme that can break down and detoxify the insecticide molecules. So synergists, such as PBO, are able to enhance the effect of several classes of insecticide, including pyrethroids, organophosphates, and carbonates. So an example could include a pyrethroid plus PBO combination bed net. Okay, so I've got a list here about some of the key elements of an IRM strategy. And it's important to outline the occurrence of the vectors in the area and include any information of their insecticide resistance status. It's important to describe the vector control interventions and also to describe the objective and rationale for the IRM strategy and outline the decision-making process. So insecticide resistance management is implemented at a strategic level, and the strategy requires a number of fundamental factors, including a decision-making body, and it's important to outline this process for establishing and strengthening the national decision-making bodies. There's regulatory requirements and procedures to be considered. Quality assurance for vector control needs to be in place to ensure that high-quality vector control products are deployed. It's important to monitor interventions after deployment and also to conduct any operational research to support vector control planning and implementation in line with IRM. So what do you do if insecticide resistance is found? Firstly, start using a different class of insecticide with a different mode of action. It's always important to use insecticides judiciously, and if resistance is detected, confirm the data with subsequent tests and rule out any misapplication or other biases. Investigate all possible causes of treatment failure and assess the extent of the problem area, and importantly, also notify the WHO and any regional authorities. So with that, I'm going to hand back to the main room, and we're going to discuss further elements of IRM and incorporating it into the strategic plans. Thank you.
So I'll just spend the next, again, it'll be a quick run through so we can catch up on some time about some key components that you need to think about your human resources strategic plan. And as Maru has just said, and as we said yesterday, as you're going through the other components, as you think about your vector surveillance, as you think about your insecticide resistance management program, as you think about your vector control strategies, there will be discussions about, well, what are the people we need? Where do they need to be? How many of them? But also, how do we get them to have the right skills, to be up to date? How do we supervise them to make sure they are doing things according to the SOPs, the quality we require? So basically, key to a HR plan is to make sure you're planning to have the right people in the right place with the right skills at the right time and in the right numbers. That's the key to what you have to think about. So as you go through every activity that you need to do in your plan, think about those questions. And so in a human resource development plan, you identify your needs, you try to match who you've already got with skills, experience, numbers, location, their age and their gender, and with that helps you identify the gaps you may have between what you've got and what your needs will be. Then you need to think, if you've got gaps, so how are we going to fill those gaps? Where are we going to get those staff? How are we going to train them up? Who are the training institutions or the trainers that we can have do that training? That might also include communities, non-government organisations, and you may need to bring in contractors or partners from within the region to help you with that training. You need to make sure that the strategies you have for building those skills are effective. And it's important to look at the timing. How long does it take to fill any gaps or to get people mobilised versus when you need to do those activities? So that's what I mean about that critical path. Having the people in the right place in the right time and right numbers is really necessary for you to do a lot of the activities. So you've got to link the pathways, the timing together, and think about how long this takes. You have to think about the budget for that training, and if it's training somewhere else, how are you going to work with those people to make sure they have the budget? And if you might need to have a plan B. What are some alternative ways that you can do this? So some of the questions to think about, and I won't go through these in detail, we'll provide them to you. But firstly, as you've got your strategic plan draft, or as you think it's final and reviewing it, do you actually have a summary of all the human resource developments? Have you clearly defined roles and responsibilities of the staff and what skills and experience levels they need to have? Are there opportunities for career progression? We know that that's important to think about, but it's also an important motivator to keep people engaged and to retain trained people in your program. So think about career paths and talk to people about, look at why people are leaving the system. Look at the age of the people who are in those jobs, because many countries, we've got an aging health service, people in the health system. And if you don't account for that over a 5-year period, you may find that many people retire, but you won't have enough people trained in time to do the work. So that's an important thing to think about. And then there's just a list there of all of the types of activities that you're likely to need to do in a vector control strategic plan and annual plans. So have you actually got people who can do that? Who are they? Identify them. If not, how are you going to find those people, develop their skills, bring people in to do that? So that's an important part of it. And as I said again, as you do the other parts of your strategies, think about the human resource questions as you design, say, your environmental management or your operations research or your behaviour change communication. And this slide just shows you, again, won't go in detail, but the types of things that should be in your human resource development plan. So it'll be an annex. It's derived from all the other HR issues you may identify as you're writing the other parts of it. Remember that you need to think of each of the levels of your health system. And remember that you may need resources to do some of these things, particularly if you need to engage other partners to support you, other governments, other non-health ministries, research institutes, or implementing partners. You may need to think about resources for that. In more detail, just briefly about the training, then, as you're thinking about those people and thinking about your pipeline of skilled people to do your vector control program, think about, when do you need training provided? Do you need training before they even start working in a vector control program, so pre-service? Is there going to need to be ongoing in-service training? And how's that going to happen? Who's going to do that? Or is there, in some cases, some specialized training that you need? You may need somebody who is the supervisor or coordinator who needs some very specific training. And where's that going to come from? Who's going to do that training? Is that training up to date? So many of you have talked about adding insecticide resistance management into your plans. Well, that means that'll have to go into the training. And are the people who would be doing the training up to date? So again, you need to plan the timing of that and plan the support for that. Remember also that once people are out on the job, they may need supportive supervision. And again, that has both a person time cost as well as costs of doing supervision. And that's important to include in your plan. You'll be thinking about how you're going to do the training and who's going to provide that training, the duration of the training, again, in case that's going to affect when you can actually start implementing some program. And of course, you must do monitoring and evaluation of the training. Is it providing what you expected in the right time, quality, quantity? And later tomorrow, I'll talk about gender and social inclusion, but this is a discussion that you have to have when you do the training plan. So the next slide will be a checklist for you to think about how to develop a training strategy in your plan. And they're just a summary of some of the things that I've already mentioned and will help you as a little checklist as you're developing your plan to make sure that you can have a good HR plan and training plan linked to your vector control strategy. Thank you. I'll make this quite short because we are running behind, and I think the group work's really important. Again, I just put up a definition of what community engagement is, and it really is involving people from design through to implementation and evaluation, and to empower them to be active members of vector control programs. Engaging communities is actually key to the success of vector control implementation, and I've put a couple of reasons there for that, particularly looking at harnessing local knowledge, expertise and skills, and that we know that when communities are appropriately engaged, they actually are often the front line in detecting and managing outbreaks, and they can assist in many of the activities. You were all talking about a shortage of staff, and so some of the health assessments, mapping, some of those monitoring activities can be done also by communities if they've been supported. And this is a key component, a key pillar of the global vector control response. This will be a good checklist for us when you're starting to look at your strategic plans, some lessons learned about and implementations for planning, but of course, your context is going to be important. A planning question you might have is, do you have people, and that's where the typo is, do you have people who can help you support participatory community-based approaches? Because we know that that's really important as part of your implementation as well as risk communication. Have you, in some of the countries that may have a lot more cultural diversity, do you understand what's required for different cultures and family structures and language structures? And do you actually have resources allocated to help you do community engagement well. Won't go through this in detail. You'll be able to see this in the slide set, but this just makes you think about, this comes from the SPC, the differences in informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and shared leadership. And ultimately, for the full community involvement, you're really looking at that shared leadership one. But it is a process that you need to move through, and it is going to be staged, particularly when you're short of people to actually run your program. You might need to think of how you phase this. So you're a community engagement plan, which will be again derived from each of the other activities. When you think about what's the role of the community here, how do we need to engage them? Here's some of the key points, and this will be a bit of a template to make you think about how you develop a community engagement plan. The other thing is to think about the risk communication, that real-time exchange of information and advice between experts and the people who are facing the threat. So how we need to think about that is we do need to think about how you also change people's behaviour and what their experiences have been before. And remember that even if people do contemplate a problem and take some action, you may need to maintain that behaviour. And maintaining that, sometimes people relapse. So you can't do some of these things one-off and think that it lasts a lifetime. It may be activities that you need to keep repeating. And there may be people you reach and some people you don't reach. So some principles of risk communication are here on this slide. Particularly important to engage the affected populations themselves and to understand who they trust and where they like to get their information from. You need build capacity for risk communication outside the times of crisis. So this should be something you have as preparation for an outbreak, but not wait till the crisis comes. And you'll need to make sure that you've got systems set up to run the risk communication operations when you need to. Again, some key points here on what you need to think about in a risk communication strategy. And again, these will be a nice checklist for you about what to look at when you try to develop this part of your strategic plan. And again, another bit of a checklist there for you. So we'll provide these to you and need you to think about in the group work how you're going to actually develop your strategic risk communication plan as well as your community engagement plan. And remember, for both of these, you must evaluate, is it actually working? Because if it's not, you may need to change it as you implement.